Dr. Mark Cook, born and bred in the United Kingdom, has an overly respected accent. Whatever he says sounds great. Reporters love to interview him. But despite his accent and his role as a supervisory scientist at the South Florida Water Management District, he is nationally recognized behavioral avian ecologist and has published over 50 manuscripts and reports on birds, waterfowl, fishes, crayfish, and exotic animal species, and he is the editor of the widely reported annual South Florida Wading Bird Report. His dig talk today is Restoring Beauty Requires a Beast or Two.
Hello, everybody. So, not so long ago, huge beasts walked the Florida landscape. If we were to go back in time to just 12,000 years ago, we would see a multitude of enormous creatures, such as the 20-foot tall giant ground sloth, armadillo-like glyptodonts the size of an SUV, and the largest mammalian land predator of all time, the 2,200-pound short-faced bear. Animal life was incredibly abundant as well. Great herds of bison, antelope, horses, and even camels stretched to the horizon, and wetlands and rivers full of fish and migratory birds. This great profusion of animal life ate, defecated, and generally bulldozed their way through this ancient landscape, and in so doing, left quite the ecological footprint. But as E.O. Wilson noted, paradise found is paradise lost. Since the dawn of human civilization, half of all land and marine megafaunal species have disappeared, have become extinct. And those that remain have declined to such an extent that the total biomass of wild vertebrates living today is just 17% of what it once was. These missing animals represent a profound problem for our understanding of ecosystems such as the Everglades, because it's becoming more and more apparent that these animals represented are a major influence on ecosystem processes. In fact, I go as far as to say that we won't actually be able to restore the Everglades if we don't restore some of these animal populations, especially those species that are important to nutrient cycling and food web dynamics. So why do I think this? Well, ecologists tend to think of nutrient dynamics from a bottom-up perspective, whereby plants and microbes run the show, and animals really are just passive consumers of nutrients. But recent research is showing that animals can actually be absolutely crucial to the cycling, to the distribution, and to the storage of nutrients such as phosphorus. A wonderful example of this is the critical role that whales play in supporting life in the very nutrient-limited surface waters of the world's oceans. Whales feed at great depths, below 1,000 meters deep, but when they come to the surface, they release what's affectionately termed a poonami, a huge explosion of poop across the surface waters. These great plumes of fertilizer are essential for stimulating the growth of phytoplankton, which allows the growth of zooplankton, which feeds the small fishes and krill, which in turn feeds larger fish, seabirds, and other critters. But that's not the end of this global animal-based nutrient pump. The seabirds splatter their coastal colonies with nutrient-enriched guano, and migratory fish, such as salmon, swim up the rivers to spawn and then die. the deep sea nutrients in the bodies of these fishes is then transported further inland with the help of bears and eagles to fertilize other habitats, such as forests. But because of the huge losses of these wildlife populations, the flow of phosphorus from the deep ocean to the land has almost come to a grinding halt at just 4% of its original rate. And this loss of nutrients clearly has ramifications for the functioning of these ecosystems. The moral of this story here is that when you remove the animals, you end up with a very different ecosystem to the one that you started with. And to restore these ecosystems, we're going to need to bring those animals back again. So this loss of critters obviously applies to the Everglades as well. Many of you are aware, I'm sure, that wading birds and crocodilians have declined considerably since the historic numbers, even decades ago. But you may be less aware that many other species have also declined considerably as well. For example, reports by Audubon wardens in the 1930s and 40s suggest that the coastal bays and lakes of the southern Everglades supported tens, if not hundreds of thousands of overwintering waterfowl and shorebirds, numbers that were an order of magnitude larger than they are today. Florida Bay supported much larger abundances of predatory species, such as multiple species of sharks, rays, dolphins, and the now extinct Caribbean monk seal. And the seagrass beds were grazed by much larger herds of manatees and green turtles. Green turtles, for example, were so abundant in the Caribbean in the 1600s that the noise they made while splashing around and snorting for breath in the shallow lakes and lagoons where they forage could actually be heard from many miles away. And sailors would actually use this noise to help them navigate among islands during foggy conditions. Massive overharvesting has reduced their numbers around Florida from estimates of tens of millions of individuals to just a few thousand today. Yet we know very little about the consequences of these losses to the ecology of Florida Bay. Oops, sorry. We know very little about the consequences of these losses to the ecology of Florida Bay. So what are we supposed to do with understanding all this? Well, fortunately, we recently had an episode in 2018 that revealed what might happen if we bring back some of these wildlife populations. So this figure shows the annual number of wading bird nests in the Everglades, that's for all species total together, over the last 33 years. And what we can see here is that since about the year 2000, we've seen quite a large jump in the number of wading bird nests. And they're averaging on an annual average of about 31,000 nests per year. But in 2018, we saw somewhat of a divergence from this general pattern. In 2018, we saw an incredible 122,000 nests. This is by far the largest nesting event we've seen in the Everglades in the last 80 years. And more importantly, this compares to the super colony nesting events of the 1930s and 40s, prior to major drainage of the Everglades. Oops. Oh gosh. Prior to major drainage of the Everglades. So what does this mean? This means that this was really good news because it shows that the resiliency of these birds. It shows how quickly we could recover some of their populations, at least for some of these species, if we get the water right again. Now, Peter Frederick and Tasso Kokoves are going to be talking about this in much greater detail in their presentations tomorrow afternoon. But for now, what I want to really talk about is how these large nesting events might impact the ecosystem resiliency and recovery, especially in the marsh mangrove ecotone, where these birds nested historically in very large numbers. So one effect of this nesting is that it might benefit a keystone species. Recent research has shown that wading bird nestlings and eggs, the poor things, can actually provide a substantial proportion of the nutritional needs of alligators during the dry season, especially for the egg-laying females. Now, if we consider that the number of wading bird nests in the Everglades, in the ecotone in 2018, was about 20 times greater than the long-term average, that equates to an awful lot more food for these for these alligators. And a lot more food for these nesting alligators. And if this kind of nesting was to replicate itself on a more consistent basis, that would equate to an awful lot more food for these alligators, it would boost the alligator population, and it would, more importantly, reinforce some of the keystone functions of this keystone species. This might include, among many things, but it might include, for example, creating essential habitat for a whole host of different species through their burrowing and nesting activities, or critical changes to the food web through their top-down effects, strong top-down effects. Now, one of the most obvious effects of these birds when you actually enter one of these colonies is the large amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus that's deposited in the form of guano. Now, the fate of these nutrients is poorly understood right now, but one potential impact is what occurs below ground. We know in mangrove habitats, for example, that if we experimentally add phosphorus to the soil sediments, this causes quite a large increase in the biomass of the fine roots. This increased growth of the roots causes the soil sediments to expand, which in turn can cause the soil elevation to rise. And this rise can occur at a rate that's equivalent to current sea level rise. Could it be that these large nesting events in the coastal ecotone were important to mangrove growth and development? And more importantly, could this growth mitigate against current sea level rise and saltwater intrusion? So in summary then, science is telling us that the bottom-up view of restoration ecology is incomplete. To restore the Everglades, we need to bring back some of these lost wildlife species that are important for recycling nutrients and energy. Right now, we tend to think of wildlife simply as the end goal of restoration, as performance measures to gauge the success of hydrologic restoration. But I think it's about time we begin to understand the true ecosystem value of our missing beasts. Thank you very much.